are the forgotten Native American heating hacks that truly beat modern standards and knowledge. Imagine facing a winter so cold it could kill an unprepared person in a single night. Native American families didn't just face it. They stayed warm inside simple teepees made of animal skin with no modern furnaces or thick walls. They survived using genius systems of air, stone, and fire that seem almost like magic. But as a monster blizzard trapped a family inside their lodge for days, they made a terrifying discovery. Their carefully rationed firewood was running out. With the fire dying and the storm raging, how could they possibly survive the night when their most important tool was gone? Tap subscribe. That way you won't miss new episodes. And tell us if you like this topic and what the next video we should make about. The story does not begin with a person, nor with the thought of a person. It begins, as so many of the oldest stories do, with the land itself. Before there was a winter to survive, or a family to endure it, there was a place waiting, a quiet invitation written in earth and water and stone. Imagine, if you will, a long river valley carved into the great expanse of the northern plains. It was not a canyon of sharp edges and dramatic shadows, but a gentler place, a wide, shallow basin smoothed and softened by the slow, heavy hand of an ancient glacier that had retreated into memory thousands upon thousands of years ago. Since that great melting, the river had spent its life patiently polishing the work of the ice, winding its way through the soft soil, carrying away the dust of mountains from 1,000 miles distant. The river was the life of this valley. In the summer, its song was a bright and hurried thing, a chatter over stones and sandbars. But now, in the time the people called the moon of the falling leaves, its voice had deepened. The water ran slower, clearer, and colder, its surface the color of a winter sky, a dark and polished mirror reflecting the bare grey arms of the trees along its banks. The air itself held a new kind of stillness, a silence that was not empty, but full of waiting. It was a silence you could feel on your skin, a crispness that carried the scent of cold water, of damp earth giving up the last of its warmth, and the faint, dry perfume of frost on fallen leaves. On the north side of the river, the land sloped upwards into a long, exposed plain, a place where the wind lived. The grasses there were pale yellow, bleached by the sun and cured by the first frosts, and they bent and swayed in a constant, restless dance. This was the domain of the north wind, the great and powerful wind that would soon come down from its home in the frozen lands, carrying the blizzards that could bury the world in white. No one would choose to spend the winter on that side, in the teeth of that wind. But on the south side of the river, the land offered a different promise. Here, a high bluff rose, not a cliff, but a steep and grassy hill that stood like a great wall, a shield against that tireless northern breath. The sun, making its low arc across the autumn sky, spent most of its day shining on this southern face, warming the earth and stones, storing a faint memory of summer that would linger long into the cold months. And it was here, tucked into a gentle curve of the river at the base of this protecting bluff, that the true invitation was found. A grove of old cottonwood trees stood gathered together, their massive trunks scarred with the history of seasons past. They had seen more winters than any person could count. Most of their leaves, once a vibrant green, had turned a pale and trembling gold, and now lay in a thick, rustling carpet on the ground below. Only a few held on, shivering in the breeze, catching the light like scattered coins. This grove was the heart of the place, the reason it had been chosen for generations. It offered more than just a windbreak. It offered life. This is what the old man saw. He stood at the edge of the grove, his body still, his gaze moving slowly, taking in everything not as a single picture, but as 100 small and important details. His name was He Who Remembers the Dawn, and his face was a map of the seasons he had lived, the lines around his eyes and mouth telling of deep cold and bright sun, of sorrow and of laughter. He did not look at the place with the eyes of a stranger admiring a pretty scene. He was reading it, page by page, like a familiar story he had known his whole life. His eyes saw the bluff not as a hill, but as the great broad shoulder of a sleeping buffalo, offering its lee side for shelter. He looked at the cottonwoods and saw not just trees, but a promise of fire, not the best fire, for their wood was soft and burned quickly, but a reliable fire, one that would give its heat generously when asked. He knew that their deep, gnarled roots, thick as a man's leg, could be dug from the frozen ground and would smolder for hours, a steady and enduring heart of coals for the coldest part of the night. He saw the willows growing thick and dense at the river's edge, their slender branches already bare. To him, they were not weeds, but a gift. He saw in their flexibility the frames for comfortable backrests to lean against inside the lodge, and the springy woven mattresses that would lift their sleeping robes from the cold ground, allowing air to circulate and keep them dry. Their inner bark, he knew, held a medicine to soothe aches and fevers. Every plant, every rise and fall of the land spoke to him of its purpose. His gaze followed the river. He noted the way the water slowed and deepened in the bend, a place where fish might gather in the winter, lethargic under the ice, but still there, a possible meal in a time of need. He looked at the stones along the bank, not for their color, but for their character. He saw the rounded, water-smoothed granite stones, the ones that would hold the heat of the fire for a long time without cracking, the ones that could be warmed and tucked into sleeping robes to chase away the deep chill of the night. He saw the places where deer and antelope had come down to drink, their tracks a clear sign in the soft mud at the water's edge. He saw the tall, dry stalks of last season's sunflowers, their heads drooping, and knew that the small, oil-rich seeds, still clinging to them, were a treasure for the birds, and for people too. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole body. He heard the whisper of the wind as it passed high overhead, unable to touch him here in the shelter of the bluff. He heard the dry rustle of the last cottonwood leaves, a sound that spoke of the coming bareness, the time of sleep for the trees. He heard the distant caw of a crow, its voice sharp and clear in the thin air, a lonely sound that seemed to make the silence around it even bigger. He could feel the quality of the light. The autumn sun was a different sun than the one of summer. It sat lower in the sky, and its light was softer, warmer in color, but holding less and less heat. It was a beautiful light, but a light that warned of the coming long nights. He tilted his head, feeling the direction of the air currents on his weathered cheek, a slight but persistent drift from the northwest, the direction of the coming cold. Everything he saw, everything he heard and felt, was a confirmation. It was all a part of an ancient and unspoken agreement between the people and the land. The land would provide, but it demanded to be understood. Its generosity was not for the foolish or the unprepared. It offered its gifts only to those who knew how to ask and how to listen for the answer. This place, this curve in the river, was the answer. It was the place of awaited cold. It was home. From the east, the family appeared. They did not arrive with a great noise or hurry, but emerged from the landscape as if they were a part of it, their movements as calm and deliberate as the slow drift of a cloud. First came the young man, the eldest son, leading a single, sturdy horse. The horse pulled a travois, two long poles that trailed behind it, supporting a basket-like platform piled high with their folded lodge, sleeping robes, and parfleche boxes filled with food and tools. The poles made a soft, rhythmic whispering sound as they slid over the fallen leaves. Walking beside the horse was the young man's wife, a baby held securely on her back in a cradleboard decorated with carefully sewn beads. Her steps were sure and steady, her eyes already scanning the ground, noting the plants, the firewood, the things that would soon occupy her hands. Behind them walked two children, a boy of about 10 winters and a girl a few years younger. They were not running or shouting, but walking with a quiet awareness that had been taught to them since they could first stand. The boy's eyes were fixed on his grandfather, the elder, watching his every posture, learning without words how a man reads the land. Behind them all, a few shaggy, wolf-like dogs trotted along, their ears up, their noses testing the 1,000 new smells of this place. They were camp dogs, members of the family, and they moved with a comfortable sense of belonging. The quiet understanding passing between all of them was palpable. There was no need for loud commands or anxious questions. Each person knew their role, their place in this slow and ancient dance of making a home. Generations of knowledge flowed through their veins, guiding their hands and feet. As they drew closer to the cottonwood grove, the elder turned to meet them, and a slight nod of his head was all that was needed. This was the spot. The work could begin. The journey of the day was over, but the much longer journey through the deep cold of winter was just about to start. Here, in this place of quiet promise, they would face it together. The work began not with a sudden burst of activity, but with a quiet and shared purpose, like a river finding its natural course. The young father, whose name was Strikes the Flint, moved to the horse and spoke to it in low, reassuring tones, his hand stroking the animal's thick neck as he unfastened the rawhide straps of the travois. The lodge poles, 15 of them in all, were a special burden. They were long and slender, peeled of their bark to a smooth, pale finish that shone softly in the afternoon light. They were lodgepole pines, a tree that did not grow here in the river valley, but in the high country, many days' journey toward the setting sun. These poles were a treasure, a family's inheritance. They'd been carefully chosen years ago, selected for their perfect straightness and their strength. Trees that had grown slow and tall in a dense forest, reaching for the light. They had been cut and seasoned, their wood hardening over time until it was as tough as bone, but still held a springy resilience. To carry them across the plains was a statement of intent, a commitment to a way of life that moved with the seasons but always carried its home along with it. The young man handled them with a respect that bordered on reverence, laying each one gently on the ground, their tips pointing toward the center of the spot where the lodge would stand. Each pole was familiar to him, He knew their individual weight, the slight curve of one, the pattern of knots on another. They were not just tools, they were the bones of their home. The woman, whose name was Singing Grass, untied the bundles that rested on the travois platform. With the help of her mother-in-law, the elder woman of the family, she carefully lifted off the great, heavy folded shape of the lodge cover. It was an immense weight, the tanned hides of more than a dozen buffalo, skillfully scraped, softened, and stitched together by generations of women's hands. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, of willow, and of the animal itself, a clean, earthy scent that was the perfume of home. The hide was supple, yet immensely strong, designed to turn away the fiercest wind, the heaviest snow, and the hardest rain. They laid it out on a clear patch of ground, a great pale semicircle of leather, waiting to be lifted and wrapped around the bones of the lodge. The two children, Walks quietly, and his sister Little Sparrow, had their own tasks. They were sent to gather stones for the central fireplace, not just any stones, but the smooth, dense river rocks their grandfather had noted earlier. Their small hands searched for the ones without cracks or fissures, the solid ones that would hold the fire's heat without complaint. It was a small job, but a vital one, and it taught them from their earliest days that everyone had a part to play in the family's survival and comfort. No one was idle. The work flowed between them, each person anticipating the needs of the others, their movements weaving together into a single, seamless act of creation. The elder, he who remembers the dawn, stood back and watched, his role now that of the quiet director. His eyes, though old, missed nothing. He pointed with his chin to the exact spot where the foundation should be laid, a place where the ground was level and drained well, a place that would catch the morning sun. Then he and his son strikes the flint, selected the 3 foundation poles. These were the strongest and heaviest of the 15, the ones that would form the tripod, the unshakable heart of the structure. It was a lesson in physics passed down through time. A 4-pole base could rock and shift in a gale, but a tripod, with its 3 points of contact on the earth, was a figure of absolute stability. The wind could push against it, but it could not make it tremble. Strikes the flint took 2 of the poles, his son-in-law handling the 3rd with ease, and laid them parallel on the ground. The boy Walks quietly, watched from a short distance, his face serious. He saw his father lay the 3rd pole across the other 2, near their tops. He watched him take a long, supple rope of braided rawhide and begin to lash the 3 poles together. The knot he used was not a simple one. It was a special tie, a pattern of wraps and turns that would hold the poles fast under immense pressure, yet allow them to be adjusted. The boy committed the pattern to memory, his mind tracing the path of the rope, knowing that one day it would be his hands doing the tying. When the knot was secure, the most important moment arrived, the raising of the tripod. The father and grandfather took their places at the base of the poles. With a deep, coordinated effort, they began to walk the poles upward, their moccasins shuffling in the dry leaves, their strength flowing into the wood. The long poles, heavy and awkward on the ground, now seemed to become lighter as they rose toward the sky, their weight finding its balance. There was a satisfying groan of wood against wood, the creak of the cart's rawhide rope pulling tight. Then, with a final, smooth push, the tripod stood, It was a simple, powerful shape against the grey sky, 3 lines converging in the air, their bases forming a perfect triangle on the earth. For a moment, it was just a skeleton, a mere suggestion of a home. But in that moment, the space was claimed. The empty air was given a center, a purpose. This was where they would live. The elder then walked the base of the 3rd pole outward, widening the triangle until it felt right, until the angle was one of both grace and strength. He did not measure with a tool, but with his eyes and with a knowledge that lived in his bones. When he was satisfied, he grunted, and his son knew the foundation was set. Now came the rhythm of the remaining poles. One by one, Strikes the Flint lifted the other 12 poles and laid them in the crotch of the tripod at the top. He worked with a steady, unhurried pace, a kind of peaceful efficiency that made the hard work look effortless. He placed each pole in its designated spot around the circle, his movements practiced and sure. Each pole he leaned into place added to the strength of the whole, their weight settling and locking the structure together. The teepee was not a structure of nails and hammers, of force and rigid joints. It was a structure of balance and tension, of components leaning on and supporting one another in a perfect circular harmony. As he worked, the shape of the home became more and more defined. The bare skeleton of the tripod was fleshed out, becoming a cone, a graceful, symmetrical form that was nature's own design for shedding the wind. The cone stood there, a web of pale wooden lines against the vast open sky, waiting for its skin. It was a beautiful thing in its starkness, a piece of profound and ancient engineering, a man-made mountain ready to face the winter. The time had come to give it its warmth and its breath. The great hide cover was ready. Singing Grass and her mother-in-law had already tied the top of the cover to the last remaining pole, which was called the lifting pole. Now, the 4 adults worked together. The men positioned the base of the lifting pole at the back of the circular frame, opposite where the door would be. Then, lifting it just as they had lifted the tripod, they walked it upwards, the immense weight of the hide cover rising with it. The hide scraped against the other poles, a heavy, soft sound as it was maneuvered into place. Then, with the lifting pole set, the real work of dressing the frame began. The woman's task now took prominence. Singing Grass took one edge of the great hide cover, and her mother-in-law took the other. They walked in opposite directions around the frame, pulling the heavy skin with them, their movements a synchronized dance. They stretched the hide taut against the poles, wrapping the conical frame in its thick, warm blanket. The pale cone of wood disappeared, and in its place stood a solid, cream-colored shape, the teepee, its surface already glowing in the low, golden light of the late afternoon. Where the 2 edges of the cover met at the front, a series of small holes had been reinforced. Singing Grass took out a pouch of hand-carved wooden pins, each one sharpened to a neat point. Starting from about halfway up, she began to pin the lodge closed, pushing the wooden skewers through the overlapping holes, stitching the great hide coat shut against the coming cold. At the very top, the cone was left open. This was the smoke hole, the lungs of the lodge, and on either side of this opening were 2 wide flaps of hide, like great ears. Each of these flaps was attached at its top corner to one of the 2 remaining poles, which were not part of the main structure, but stood on the outside. These were the smoke flap poles. The elder took them now, and with great care, He adjusted them, pushing and pulling them to open the flaps just so, angled away from the subtle northwest breeze. This was one of the true secrets of the teepee's genius. These flaps were the teepee's ventilation system. By adjusting them, the family could control the flow of air, creating a draft that would pull the smoke from the fire straight up and out while preventing wind and rain from coming in. They could be tuned to any wind from any direction, making the lodge a living, breathing thing, always in conversation with the weather. As the final pin was pushed into place and the smoke flaps were set, a new feeling settled over the small camp. The frantic energy of travel was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of arrival. The teepee stood complete, a small, unshakable island of order and intent in the vast wilderness. It was not just a tent, it was a home, imbued with the spirit of the buffalo that gave its hide and the forest that gave its poles. It was a sanctuary, a breathable mountain. For a brief and peaceful moment, a sense of deep security settled over the family. The dogs lay down near the entrance, their watch begun. The children brought their last stones to the center of the lodge floor. Inside, the world was already quieter, the wind's voice muffled by the thick hide. The light that filtered through the skin was soft and diffused, a gentle, calming glow. The camp was established, the mountain was raised, and now they were ready to bring the fire, the heart, into its home. With the great conical home now standing, a sense of profound and earned peace settled upon the family. The air inside was already different from the world outside. The thick, pale walls of buffalo hide diffused the afternoon light, filling the circular space with a soft, golden glow that felt both warm and private. The ever-present voice of the wind, which had been their constant companion on the plains, was now a muffled whisper, a distant reminder of the wilderness held safely at bay. It was as if they had stepped from the vast, open world into a sanctuary, a quiet heart in the center of the land. Singing Grass and her mother-in-law, the elder woman whose name was Long Arrow Woman, began the work of turning the empty shelter into a home. They unrolled the heavy sleeping robes, tanned hides thick with the soft, dark wool of the buffalo, and laid them in their designated places around the interior circle. The place of honor at the back of the lodge, opposite the doorway, was for the elder, he who remembers the dawn. The other sleeping areas were arranged according to family custom, a map of relationships and respect made visible on the floor. Strikes the Flint brought in the willow backrests, comfortable tripods of smooth wood with a webbing of rawhide, and set them up so they could lean back and rest their bodies after the day's labor. The children, their task of gathering stones complete, sat quietly, watching the familiar rituals unfold, the quiet magic of making home. A small stack of dry willow twigs and cottonwood branches lay near the central fire pit, ready to be given to the flame. For this brief, golden hour, all was right. The land had provided the perfect place. The lodge had risen without difficulty, and the promise of a secure and comfortable winter felt as real and solid as the ground beneath them. The comfort, however, was a fragile thing, as temporary as the last leaves clinging to the cottonwood branches. The first person to sense the change was Long Arrow Woman. She had lived more than 60 winters, and her body was a finely tuned instrument for reading the language of the seasons, a language that spoke not in words, but in sensations. She was sitting on a robe near the entrance, her skilled hands busy mending a small tear in one of her son's winter moccasins. Her movements fluid and economical from a lifetime of practice. The door flap, a separate piece of hide, had been propped open just enough to let in the fading light. A gentle current of air drifted in, carrying the scent of the river and the dry leaves. She had been feeling this same breeze all afternoon, but now something was different. It was not a change in direction. The air still came from the northwest. It was not even a noticeable drop in temperature. It was something more subtle, more elemental. A new quality had entered the air, an edge that was not there an hour before. It was a cold that felt ancient and vast, a cold that carried with it the silence of immense, empty distances. It was a dry, sharp cold that seemed to suck the moisture from the air and from her own skin. She paused in her sewing, her needle held motionless in her calloused fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the feeling wash over her. It was a sensation she had not felt for a very long time, but one she had never forgotten. It was the breath of the deep winter, the true cold, the one that came from the frozen heart of the Northland, and it was coming far too early. It was a whisper, but a whisper that carried the threat of a scream. At that same moment, one of the camp dogs, a large shaggy male with wise yellow eyes, had been sleeping soundly by the fire pit. He had been dreaming, his paws twitching as he chased phantom rabbits across a summer prairie. Suddenly, the dream vanished. He lifted his heavy head, his body instantly alert. His ears, which had been relaxed, now stood erect, swiveling not toward a sound, but as if trying to locate something he could feel but not hear. There was no snap of a twig, no call of a bird, nothing to warrant his sudden attention. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound of deep and instinctual anxiety. He rose to his feet, stretched his body low to the ground, and began to pace the small interior of the teepee. His nose was in the air, tasting the atmosphere. It was not a scent he was after. He was sensing something far more fundamental. The air pressure, which had been stable all day, was beginning to fall. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, a sign that a massive weather system was moving, pushing the stable air out of its way, creating a void that would soon be filled with wind and snow. The other dog, a younger female, sensed his agitation. She got up as well, not pacing, but pressing herself against the legs of Singing Grass, seeking a comfort that the changing world was no longer offering. The animals knew. Their bodies were telling them a storm was gathering, a storm unlike the usual autumn squalls. Their restlessness was a barometer, more accurate than any man-made tool. The quiet, domestic rhythm of the teepee was broken. Singing Grass stopped her work of arranging their belongings and put a comforting hand on the dog's head, feeling the tense muscles beneath the fur. She looked at her mother-in-law and saw the stillness in the old woman's posture, the distant look in her eyes. Strikes the Flint, who had been lashing a bundle of firewood together just outside the entrance, noticed the sudden silence. He glanced inside and saw the uneasy dogs and the look on his mother's face, and he knew instantly that something was wrong. He looked over at his father. He, who remembers the dawn, had just finished hobbling the horse in the thickest part of the cottonwood grove, ensuring it would have shelter and could graze on the last of the cured grasses. The elder was walking back toward the teepee, his steps unhurried, but his journey was interrupted. He stopped about 30 paces from the lodge and stood perfectly still, his head tilted back, his gaze fixed on the sky. The sky had changed. The warm, hazy blue of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a high, pale, milky light that seemed thin and brittle. And against this strange backdrop, a new kind of cloud was gathering. They were not the low, heavy clouds that brought a gentle rain or a soft snow. These were impossibly high, impossibly thin wisps of pure white, stretched out across the dome of the heavens, like streaks of bone dust, or the fine spun silk of a spider's web. They were beautiful in their delicate, feathery patterns, but it was a cold and terrible beauty. The old man knew these clouds well. He knew that they lived in a part of the sky so high and so cold that they were made not of water vapor, but of tiny crystals of ice. They were the advance guard, the first visible sign of a colossal shift in the great rivers of the air. They were a message written across the sky that a vast and powerful mass of frigid air from the Arctic was beginning its descent, pouring down across the plains like an unstoppable, invisible flood. He could see that the fine, wispy tails of the clouds were all pointing in the same direction, a sign that the winds in the upper atmosphere were screaming, moving with a speed and force that would soon be felt on the ground. The sun, now low in the west, shone through them, and its light was encircled by a faint but discernible halo, a ring of pale light caused by the refraction of the sunlight through the ice crystals. It was one of the oldest and most certain signs of a coming blizzard. He stood there for a long time, reading the signs, his mind piecing together the evidence, the feeling of the air that his wife had sensed, the restlessness of the dogs that his son had seen, and now the story written in the sky. It all pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The predictable, manageable cold of the changing season was about to be swept away. What was coming was not a storm, but a siege, a true blizzard, a great white darkness that could bury the world, erase the landscape, and last for days on end, a relentless assault of wind and snow that would test the strength of their lodge, the depth of their preparations, and the heart of their wisdom. With a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered his head and walked the final few paces to the teepee, his face set in a calm but serious expression. He pushed aside the door flap and stepped into the soft light inside. The entire family looked to him, their faces questioning and expectant. He met their eyes, one by one. There was no fear in his gaze, only a deep and profound gravity. He spoke, and his voice was quiet, but it filled the small space. "The snow that hides the trail is coming," he said. "The great storm is on the wind. It will be here before the night is old." A new energy immediately filled the lodge. The gentle pace of settling in vanished, replaced by a quiet, focused urgency. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. It wasted energy and clouded the mind. What they had now was purpose. Every action taken from this moment forward was no longer about simple comfort. It was about survival. Singing Grass and Long Arrow Woman began a quick but thorough inventory of their supplies. They checked the parfleche boxes containing the dried meat and the pounded pemmican, counting the stores, their minds silently calculating how many days it would last if they were trapped. Strikes the flint, turned without a word, and went back outside, his hand axe in his grasp. He would not stop gathering wood until the light failed completely. He ignored the plentiful, soft cottonwood and began to search desperately for any deadfall from the few oak trees that grew along the bluff. for the dense, heavy hardwood that burned slow and hot and would be worth more than gold in the nights to come. He who remembers the dawn, directed his young grandson, walks quietly. The boy was sent to gather handfuls of the driest moss and the fluffiest cured grass he could find. His small, nimble fingers were then tasked with methodically stuffing this insulation into every tiny gap and seam around the bottom edge of the teepee cover where it met the ground, sealing their home against the insidious infiltration of the wind. Every movement was now precise, every task essential. They were fortifying their small, man-made mountain, preparing their warm, breathing sanctuary to withstand a siege from the full, unbridled power of winter. As Strikes the Flint moved with focused haste in the fading twilight outside, the work inside the lodge took on a different, but equally vital, character. The domain of the teepee's interior, its heart and its function, belonged to the women. Long Arrow Woman and Singing Grass moved not with the hurried energy of their husband and son, but with a deep, methodical grace, a practiced economy of motion that spoke of a wisdom held not in the mind alone, but in the hands, in the muscles, in the rhythm of their very breathing. Their first task, now that the threat of the storm was no longer a possibility but a certainty, was to raise the teepee's inner skin. This was one of the most profound secrets to their survival. A piece of engineering so simple in its materials, yet so complex in its understanding of the natural world, that it bordered on a form of quiet magic. It was the system that would allow a small, well-tended fire to warm their entire living space, even when a gale of unimaginable cold was trying to tear the warmth away. From a long, cylindrical parfleche bag, they carefully unrolled the dew cloth, or the teepee liner. It was not made of the same thick, heavy hide as the outer cover. This inner wall was a tapestry of much finer skins, perhaps a dozen antelope and deer hides, scraped and tanned to the texture of soft, pliable chamois. The hides had been stitched together with sinew so fine that the seams were nearly invisible, forming a single, continuous curtain of leather about 6 feet high. Unlike the plain, functional exterior of the lodge, this inner skin was a canvas of memory and meaning. Over the years, figures had been painted upon it in soft, earthy pigments of red ochre, yellow clay, and charcoal black. There were the stylized shapes of buffalo, their bodies heavy with power, a testament to the animal that gave them life, shelter, and sustenance. There were images of the dragonfly, a symbol of resilience and the illusion-breaking power of the wind. And there were personal symbols, marks that recorded the significant events in the life of the family: the birth of a child, a successful hunt, a vision dreamt by the elder. When hung, these images would face inward, a private gallery of their history that would be illuminated by the flickering firelight, reminding them of who they were and where they came from. The liner was more than a tool for warmth. It was the soul of the home. The top edge of this great leather curtain was pierced with small, reinforced holes, and through these holes, short loops of rawhide were tied. This was the mechanism for hanging it. Long Arrow Woman moved to the north side of the lodge, and her daughter-in-law took the south. They did not tie the liner directly to the main lodge poles themselves. To do so would have defeated its purpose. Instead, they had already strung a separate rope of thick, braided buffalo hair circling the interior and tied to each of the 15 poles, about level with their shoulders. This rope created the anchor point. Working in unison, they They began to lift sections of the liner, tying the rawhide loops to this inner rope. Their hands moved with a swift, certain dexterity, using a slip knot that could be easily adjusted but would hold firm under tension. They worked their way around the circle, their movements creating a soft, rustling sound as the fine leather slid against the wooden poles. They did not pull it tight. The goal was to let the liner hang down freely, its bottom edge resting lightly on the floor of the teepee, several inches inside the main lodge cover. When they were finished, a complete wall of soft, decorated hide encircled the entire living space, creating a room within a room. And in between this new inner wall and the teepee's outer cover, a channel was formed, a continuous, unbroken air gap, a little wider than a man's hand, that ran from the floor all the way up to the smoke hole far above. This gap was the secret. It was the teepee's breath. He who remembers the dawn, his own outdoor tasks completed, came inside and sat upon his robe at the place of honor, watching his wife and daughter-in-law complete their work. He motioned for his grandson, Walks quietly, to sit beside him. The boy had finished his job of sealing the outer edge and now sat with wide, curious eyes, feeling the profound shift in the atmosphere inside their home. The elder did not speak in a loud voice, but in a low, calm tone, meant for the boy alone, explaining the wisdom that was now unfolding before his eyes. He pointed with his lips toward the bottom edge of the outer wall. "The cold is like a mouse," he said softly. "It is always looking for a way in. It creeps under the edge of the lodge, no matter how well you seal it. It is a quiet thief that comes to steal your warmth." He then gestured to the open space, the channel between the two walls. "But we do not fight the cold," he continued. "We give it a path. We give it a job to do. We show it the way out." He explained how that cold, heavy air, once it slipped under the outer cover, was immediately trapped in that channel. It could not spill out onto the floor to chill their feet or create drafts upon their backs because the liner, the inner skin, blocked its way. It was a fence, a barrier that contained the intruder. This captured air, he explained, was then presented with a choice. It could sit at the bottom, cold and stagnant, or it could move. And the fire in the center of the lodge, which would soon be lit, was a powerful force of persuasion. Even though the fire was on the inside of the liner, its radiant heat warmed the hide, and that warmth passed through to the air trapped in the channel. As the air in that narrow space began to warm even just a little, it changed. It became lighter. It began to desire to rise, just as smoke desires to rise. And high above, the smoke hole acted like a river, pulling everything upward and outward. The small fire created a powerful, steady draft, a column of rising air that was the teepee's chimney. This draft, this invisible, upward-flowing river, pulled on the air trapped in the channel. The cold air that had snuck in at the bottom was drawn into this upward current. It began to travel up the walls, flowing silently between the two layers of hide, a hidden stream of air moving steadily toward the sky. As it rose, it took with it the dampness that might otherwise collect on the inner walls, keeping the living space dry. And most importantly, it took the drafts with it. The very same cold air that would have been a source of misery and danger was harnessed, tamed, and turned into a vital part of the teepee's circulatory system. It became a silent, elegant engine, powered by the fire itself that constantly renewed the air, swept away the cold and drew the smoke straight up and out. The effect was immediate and profound. The air inside the inner circle, the true living space of the family, became remarkably still. A person could sit with their back leaned against the liner and feel no cold spot, no creeping chill. The radiant heat from the central fire, instead of being immediately stolen by drafts, was now held within this inner sanctum, reflecting off the pale hide walls, creating an even and consistent warmth. The smoke, instead of swirling and clouding the space on its lazy journey to the roof, was now captured by the powerful draft and pulled upwards in a clean, straight column, disappearing through the hole at the apex as if drawn by a string. The air was clean, clear, and breathable. It was a marvel of applied physics, an understanding of convection and thermodynamics, born not from books and equations, but from thousands of years of careful observation, of living within the cycles of nature and learning to work with its forces rather than against them. It was a solution of pure elegance, using the problem, the infiltrating cold, as a key part of its own solution. Without this inner skin, a teepee in a blizzard would be a cold, smoky, and miserable place. With it, it became what it was meant to be, an unshakable island of warmth and life, a small, breathing mountain that could withstand the worst the world outside could throw at it. The children could sleep soundly, even when a gale was howling. The elders could rest their old bones without the damp chill sinking in. The family was not just sheltered, they were secure, wrapped in a double layer of hide and a triple layer of wisdom. And as Long Arrow Woman smoothed the last wrinkle from the hanging liner, the home was now truly ready. Its lungs were in place. It was ready to breathe. With the inner skin of the lodge hung and the living space secured, the focus of the family now contracted, drawing inward to the very center of their world, the fire pit. This was not a grand hearth of stone and mortar, but a simple, shallow depression, dug into the earth, ringed with the smooth, dense river stones the children had gathered. It was small, no wider than the reach of a man's arms, yet it was the absolute heart of the home. Everything radiated from this point: warmth, light, life, and the center of the family's social circle. To a stranger, the fire that would soon live here might seem inadequate, a paltry thing against the coming fury of a plains blizzard. A modern person might imagine the need for a roaring, consuming bonfire to fight back the intense cold. But that was not the way. The people of the plains knew that a large, hot fire was a fool's fire. It devoured precious fuel with astonishing speed, created dangerous sparks that could ignite the lodge, and produced so much billowing smoke that it would overwhelm the smoke hole and fill the living space with a choking haze. A large fire was an enemy, a wild and wasteful thing. The winter fire, the fire of survival, was its opposite. It was a small, quiet, and intensely managed source of life, a creature that was tamed, understood, and respected, fed with precision and care, not with abandon. Its purpose was not to conquer the cold through brute force, but to create a bubble of sufficient warmth through steady and efficient radiation, a goal that required wisdom far more than it required wood. The preparation of the fire was a ritual, and it was the responsibility of Strikes the Flint. He entered the teepee as the last of the evening light died in the sky, his arms loaded with the wood he had managed to gather. The air he brought in with him was now bitingly cold, and the first fine grains of ice-like snow were beginning to hiss against the hide cover of the teepee. He deposited the wood with care, not in a careless jumble, but sorted into 3 distinct piles, a hierarchy of fuel that every Plains child learned before they could properly speak. This was the first lesson in the art of fire, knowing your wood. The first pile was the smallest, consisting of slender, dry willow twigs and handfuls of the fluffy, silver-grey sage that grew on the high parts of the bluff. This was the kindling, the fire's first breath. Willow was a generous wood. It caught the spark eagerly and burned with a bright, hot, and quick flame, but it had little substance. It was the coaxing word, not the long conversation. The second and largest pile was the main fuel source, dried cottonwood. The branches and roots he had gathered were seasoned and brittle, light for their size. Cottonwood was the workhorse of the winter fire. It was plentiful in the river valleys, and it provided a good, steady heat, burning cleanly with little smoke. It was a reliable and honest wood, but it too was consumed at a steady rate. A single night of deep cold could easily consume all the cottonwood an entire family could gather in a day. It was the fuel for the living hours of the evening and the morning. The third pile was the smallest and most precious. It was a carefully hoarded collection of gnarled, heavy pieces of oak and ash, dense hardwoods that Strikes the Flint had found in a protected drawer. This wood was different. It felt heavy and solid in the hand, and it was reluctant to burn. It required a hotbed of coals to get started, but once it caught, it held the fire for an incredibly long time, glowing with a deep, radiant orange and releasing its heat slowly, methodically. This was the wood for the deep of the night, for the hours after midnight when the cold was at its most profound and dangerous, the hours when the family was asleep and could not tend the flame. A single, well-placed log of oak could keep a bed of life-giving coals alive until dawn. To waste a piece of this wood during the day was unthinkable. It was a treasure, a form of insurance against the darkness, and it was rationed with the utmost care. Strikes the Flint knelt before the cold and empty fire pit. He did not simply toss the wood in. He began by creating a small, intricate structure. First, a bed of the driest, fluffiest sage, then a tiny teepee-like cone of the smallest willow twigs placed above it. It was a nest, a delicate cradle waiting for the spark. From a leather pouch on his belt, he took out his fire-making kit. It was not a complex thing. A piece of flint, a shard of iron pyrite, and a small, soft deerskin bag containing charred cattail fluff, his tinder. He held the fluff in his left hand, and with his right, he struck the pyrite with the edge of the flint. The motion was sharp, practiced, and downward. A small shower of faint, yellow sparks fell from the collision of stone and mineral. For 3 strikes, nothing happened. The sparks died in the cold air, but on the 4th strike, a single, tiny spark, no bigger than the eye of a needle, landed in the center of the dark, velvety fluff. For a moment, it seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then, a tiny, glowing orange eye opened in the tinder. It was a fragile and beautiful thing, a pinpoint of living heat in the growing cold of the lodge. The fire was born. Strikes the Flint did not rush. He brought the tinder close to his lips and began to breathe upon it, not with a hard puff of air that would blow it out, but with a long, slow, and incredibly gentle stream of breath, a whisper of life. He was feeding the infant spark, nurturing it, coaxing it to grow. The tiny orange eye brightened, expanded, and soon the entire clump of tinder was a single glowing coal. With steady hands, he placed this living ember into the heart of the sage nest he had built. He continued to breathe, his breath now directed at the base of the nest. A thin, fragrant wisp of white smoke curled upwards, carrying the clean, sharp scent of sage. Then, with a soft, satisfying whoosh, a tiny, bright yellow flame leapt into existence. The fire was alive. He carefully added more of the small willow twigs, one by one, letting the new flames grow in confidence and strength, never overwhelming it, never starving it. Only when the willow was burning with a steady, crackling flame did he begin to add the first small pieces of cottonwood. The life of the fire was now established, but the fire itself was only part of the system. Arranged in a neat semicircle just outside the ring of stones that contained the fire were a dozen other stones. These were the smooth, fist-sized granite rocks that the elder had identified by the riverbank. They were not to be placed in the fire itself, for the intense, direct heat could cause moisture trapped deep inside the stone to expand and crack them, sometimes with explosive force. Instead, they were placed beside the fire, close enough to soak up its radiant heat. These stones were a kind of battery, a way to store the fire's energy. Over the course of the evening, they would absorb the heat, becoming almost too hot to touch. They were portable radiators, extensions of the hearth. Later in the night, these hot stones would be wrapped in pieces of soft leather or rabbit fur and tucked into the bedding of the elders and the children, their slow, steady release of warmth warding off the deep chill that could settle into a person's bones during sleep. They could be held in the hands of Long Arrow Woman to keep her fingers nimble for her sewing, or placed at the feet to prevent them from becoming numb. It was a way to spread the fire's influence, to carry its warmth to the edges of the lodge without needing a larger flame. And even the ashes of the fire had a critical role to play. In the final moments before the family settled down to sleep, the last glowing embers of the fire would not be allowed to simply burn out. They would be carefully covered and banked with a thick layer of the fine, grey ash from previous fires. This blanket of ash acted as an insulator, cutting off the oxygen and slowing the rate of combustion to a near standstill. The embers would not burn, but they would not die. They would hold their heat, smouldering deep within their grey tomb throughout the night, so that in the cold, dark morning, a single gentle stir and a puff of breath would be all that was needed to bring the flames back to life. To have a live coal waiting in the morning was a gift of immeasurable comfort and security, saving the difficult and uncertain work of starting a new fire from a cold spark. Every part of the process, from the sorting of the wood to the preservation of the coals, was a testament to a deep understanding of energy, conservation, and the quiet, persistent rhythms of survival. The life of the fire was a cycle, carefully managed from its birth as a spark to its rebirth from the ashes, the true and unwavering heartbeat of the winter home. As the small, well-managed fire in the center of the teepee pulsed with a steady, living light, its warmth began to fill the inner sanctum of the lodge. The orange flames cast dancing shadows upon the painted figures of the dew cloth, making the buffaloes seem to shift their great shoulders, and the dragonflies appear to flutter in the warm air. The comforting smell of burning cottonwood and sage mingled with the familiar scent of tanned hide and dried herbs, creating the unique and reassuring perfume of home. But the fire's warmth, as vital as it was only one part of a threefold system of survival against the deep cold. The second part was the warmth they carried with them, the warmth they wore upon their bodies and slept beneath at night. This was the warmth of the buffalo's gift, a portable shelter of fur and hide that was a marvel of insulation and design, perfected over countless generations of life on the windswept plains. It was a meditation on the simple but profound principle of trapped air, a concept understood not through scientific study, but through the lived experience of what kept a body alive when the world was trying to freeze it. Their clothing was not a matter of fashion, but of pure, life-sustaining function, and it was built in layers. The innermost layer, worn directly against the skin, was made of the softest, most supple deerskin or antelope hide, tanned to a velvety texture that felt smooth and comfortable. This first layer's primary job was not just to provide a bit of warmth, but to manage moisture, to wick away the perspiration that even in the coldest weather could be generated by the effort of gathering wood or walking through deep snow. They knew, with a certainty born of hard-won experience, that dampness was a deadly enemy, a thief that could steal the body's heat 25 times faster than the dry cold alone. To be wet in a blizzard was a death sentence, so this inner layer was their first line of defense, a thin, breathable skin that kept them dry from the inside. Over this came the true insulating layers. For a shirt or a dress, this would be another layer of tanned hide, perhaps from a deer or an elk. But this one was often worn with the hair side turned inward. The dense, soft fur was not there just for its softness, but for the millions of tiny air pockets it created. It was this trapped, dead air, warmed by the body's own furnace, that provided the real insulation. Air is a poor conductor of heat, and a layer of still air, held close to the body, is one of the most effective insulators in the natural world. They had learned this lesson from the animals themselves, from the bison with its thick woolly undercoat and the rabbit with its downy fur. They were simply borrowing the genius of creation. For their legs, they wore leggings of a similar construction, tied to a belt at the waist, and on their feet, the all-important moccasins. A winter moccasin was a far more complex piece of equipment than its summer counterpart. It was made with a high, wrap-around cuff that could be tied snugly at the ankle to keep out the snow. The sole was often a thick piece of tough, raw hide from the neck of a buffalo bull, providing a durable barrier against the frozen ground. But the real secret of the winter moccasin was what went inside it. Before putting them on, they would line them with a thick, soft padding of dried grass or moss. This grassy sock served a dual purpose. It was a superb insulator, creating another thick layer of trapped air all around the foot, cushioning it from the relentless cold of the earth. But just as importantly, it was a natural moisture wick. As the foot inevitably perspired, the dry grass would absorb the dampness, drawing it away from the skin and keeping the foot dry and warm. At the end of the day, this damp grass liner would be removed and replaced with a fresh, dry one for the next morning. A simple but critical piece of daily maintenance in the fight against frostbite. The final and most iconic layer was the great buffalo robe. This was more than a coat. It was a personal, portable shelter. A single, large hide from a mature bull. It was tanned with a thick, dark, curly hair left on, a process that took many weeks of hard, patient work by the women. The hide was so large, it could be wrapped entirely around a person, from their head down to their ankles. When worn with the thick, woolly fur facing outwards, it was nearly impervious to the wind. The snow that landed on it would rest there, unmelted by the body's heat, and could be easily shaken off. The robe was a shield, a bulwark against the storm, allowing a person to move about outside for short periods with a surprising degree of comfort, carrying their own warm microclimate with them. Inside the lodge, it served as a blanket, a cushion to sit upon, or an extra layer of insulation against the cold ground. It was the family's most prized and versatile possession, a direct inheritance of the warmth and strength of the great animal that was the center of their universe. Each member of the family had their own robe, a familiar and comforting weight that they had slept under since childhood. And it was in the preparation for sleep that the third and final aspect of their system of warmth came into play. The bed itself was not just a pile of robes thrown on the ground. It was an engineered sleeping platform, a carefully constructed multi-layered system designed to combat the single greatest threat to warmth at night, the cold, frozen earth. The ground is a vast and relentless heat sink. It will pull the warmth out of a body with shocking efficiency through the process of conduction. To lie directly on the frozen ground, even with a thick buffalo robe, would be to invite a deep and dangerous chill into the very core of one's body. So they built their beds up, layer by layer. The first layer, placed directly on the earthen floor of the teepee, was a thick mat of woven willow boughs. The springy crisscrossing branches created a platform that elevated them an inch or two off the ground, creating a crucial air gap that immediately broke the conductive link with the earth's cold. This willow mattress provided a foundation of air, the great insulator. Over the top of this springy base, they laid large flat mats woven from river reeds or cattail leaves. These mats were dense and smooth, preventing the coarser willow branches from poking through and further sealing the air gaps below. They also added another layer of insulation and provided a clean, even surface for the final layers. Only now, on top of this carefully prepared platform, did they place their bedding. The first layer was often a hide of a bear or an elk with a thick hair side facing up, creating a soft and deeply insulated mattress. And on top of this, they would lay their personal buffalo robes. To sleep was to slip between two of these great, heavy robes, one below and one above, creating a personal cocoon of warmth. The feeling was one of immense weight and profound security. The heavy hide on top would press down, sealing off any drafts, while the body's own heat would quickly warm the small enclosed space trapped by the millions of insulating fibers of the buffalo's wool. The warmth was not just a comfort, it was a physical presence, a heavy, reassuring blanket of life in the midst of the vast, cold emptiness of the winter night. Within minutes of settling into such a bed, the world of the storm outside, the screaming wind, the biting cold, would recede, becoming a distant and powerless thing. They had not defeated the cold. They had outwitted it, using their intimate knowledge of materials, of air, and of the unchangeable laws of nature to create a small, unassailable fortress of warmth, not with walls of stone, but with layers of willow, rush, and the living warmth of the buffalo's shaggy coat. The teepee was now a complete and functioning system. The outer skin, pinned tight against the gale, shed the wind and snow. The inner liner, hanging gracefully within, harnessed the drafts and purified the air. The small, central fire provided a steady, radiant glow, its energy stored and distributed by the patient stones at its edge. And the family, wrapped in their layers of hide and fur, rested on beds engineered to insulate them from the frozen earth. But there was one final source of warmth, one last crucial piece of the puzzle that was as important as any of the others. It was a warmth that did not come from outside the body, but from deep within it. It was the inner fire, the slow, metabolic burn of sustenance, a furnace that had to be fed with the right kind of fuel. The wisdom of survival was not just in knowing how to build a shelter or tend a fire, but in knowing what to eat when the world turned cold. Food was not merely for satisfying hunger. It was a tool, a form of concentrated fuel that the body could transform into life-sustaining heat. As the evening deepened and the first true howls of the blizzard began to press against the lodge walls, Singing Grass and Long Arrow Woman turned their attention to the evening meal. This would not be an elaborate feast, but a spare and purposeful offering, every component chosen for its energy and efficiency. From one of the stiff, folded rawhide envelopes known as parfleche boxes, containers painted with bold, geometric designs that identified their contents, Singing Grass took out the main sustenance of their winter life, the dried buffalo meat. In the seasons of plenty, the late summer and early fall when the herds were fat, the family had worked tirelessly to prepare for the long, lean months to come. Great quantities of buffalo meat had been cut into thin, wide sheets and hung on drying racks in the hot, dry prairie wind and sun. The sun and the wind were their partners, pulling the moisture from the meat, preserving it, and concentrating its flavor and its substance until it was hard, dark, and almost weightless. This was jerky, a food that could last for years if kept dry, a perfect portable protein that required no cooking. She took a few of these hard strips and, using a stone pounder, broke them into smaller, more manageable pieces, which she distributed among the family. Chewing the tough, dry meat was hard work, but as it softened in the mouth, it released a rich, smoky flavor that was both satisfying and deeply familiar. It was the taste of the prairie, the taste of life itself. But protein alone was not enough for the deep cold. The body's most efficient fuel for generating heat was not protein, but fat. Fat was the true engine of the inner furnace. Modern science has confirmed what the people of the plains knew through instinct and observation for millennia. The digestion and metabolism of fats produces a significant amount of thermal energy, a process known as diet-induced thermogenesis. Put simply, eating fat makes you warmer from the inside out, and they had the perfect food for this purpose. From a smaller, more carefully protected pouch, Long Arrow Woman took out their most precious winter provision, pemmican. The name itself came from a Cree word meaning manufactured grease. But this simple description did no justice to the brilliance of its creation. Pemmican was the ultimate survival food, a dense, nutrient-rich powerhouse that was the pinnacle of their food preservation technology. Its creation was a long and arduous process, another of the tasks of the plentiful seasons. It began with the same sun-dried buffalo meat, but instead of being left in strips, it was pounded into a fine, almost fluffy powder using stone mallets on a hide. This pulverized meat was the protein base. To this, They added dried berries, chokecherries, service berries, or wild plums that had been gathered and painstakingly pitted during the summer. These berries, pounded into a paste, added a tart, fruity sweetness, but more importantly, they provided essential vitamins and acted as a natural preservative. The final and most critical ingredient was the fat. The rendered sweet, the hard white fat from around the kidneys and loin of the buffalo was considered the best. This fat was carefully melted down over a low fire until it became a clear, liquid tallow. This hot liquid gold was then poured over the mixture of powdered meat and crushed berries, and the entire mass was kneaded and mixed together until every particle was coated and saturated. The resulting paste was then packed tightly into rawhide bags, which were sewn shut. As the tallow cooled, it solidified, creating a solid, airtight block of food that was almost completely impervious to spoilage. The result was a food of astonishing caloric density. A small handful of this rich, dark, slightly sweet, and intensely savory mixture contained an immense amount of energy. It was a complete meal in a single bite, a perfect balance of protein, fat, vitamins, and flavor. A warrior on a raid or a hunter on a long trip could carry weeks' worth of sustenance in a small bag of pemmican, traveling light and fast without the need for cooking fires. In the winter lodge, it was their primary source of inner heat. A small ball of this mixture, about the size of a person's thumb, eaten before settling into the sleeping robes for the night, would provide a slow, steady release of energy, feeding the metabolic fire throughout the coldest hours. Tonight, Long Arrow Woman passed around a small piece to each member of the family, a supplement to their meal of dried meat. The children chewed it slowly, savoring the rich, fatty taste and the burst of sweetness from the hidden berries. It was a comforting taste, a taste of security. They also drank a simple tea made from the leaves of the wild mint that grew along the riverbank, which they had gathered and dried in the fall. The hot liquid was soothing, but it also served a practical purpose, helping to warm the body's core and aiding in digestion. Their larder was not vast, but it was intelligent. It contained other things as well: braids of dried wild onions, bags of dried prairie turnips, and nuts from the few scrub oaks on the bluff. But the foundation of their winter survival rested on the two great gifts of the buffalo: its lean, preserved muscle and its life-giving, heat-generating fat. This was a diet perfectly adapted to the demands of their environment, a diet that provided not just the calories to survive, but the specific nutritional tools needed to thrive in a world of profound and unrelenting cold. As they finished their simple meal and the last of the mint tea, a noticeable sense of contentment and well-being settled over them. The food was beginning its work. Their inner fires, well stoked, were burning a little brighter, a little hotter. They were not just weathering the storm on the outside. They were meeting it with a quiet, steady warmth from within, a resilience that was eaten and digested, a strength that was carried in the blood and in the bones. The family was a complete system, their lodge a system, their bodies another, all working in a quiet, synchronized harmony against the great, cold silence that now pressed in from all sides. Night fell, not with the gentle fading of twilight, but like a heavy curtain dropped suddenly upon the world. Outside the small, glowing cone of the teepee, the universe had dissolved into a maelstrom of violent, featureless white. The blizzard, which had begun with a whisper and a few scattered grains of snow, had now arrived in its full and terrifying power. The wind, no longer a simple breeze from the northwest, was a solid, screaming force, a physical presence that hammered against the taut buffalo hide of the lodge. It was a sound that was not just a sound. It was a pressure felt in the bones, a deep, monotonous, and overwhelming roar that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It was the sound of chaos, of a world torn from its gentle moorings. The snow was no longer falling in flakes but driving horizontally, a scouring blast of fine, sharp ice crystals that erased every landmark, every contour of the valley, burying the river, the trees, and the very ground under a deep and ever-growing shroud. To step outside the lodge door would be to step into a form of blindness, into a churning void where the concepts of up and down, of direction and distance, had lost all meaning. The world as they knew it was gone, replaced by a formless, shrieking oblivion. But inside the teepee, a different reality held sway. Here, the storm's terrible voice was tamed, muffled by the thick hide walls into a deep, rhythmic, and almost soothing hiss, the sound of a great beast prowling safely outside the door. The frantic energy of preparation had subsided, replaced by a calm and steady rhythm of existence, a quiet choreography of life that was as old as the storms themselves. A profound sense of peace had settled over the family, the deep peace that comes when all preparations are made, and all that is left is to endure. The world had been reduced to this single, warm, circular room, and within its gentle glow, life continued in a slow, deliberate, and comforting cadence. Each member of the family had their place, their role, their quiet task that contributed to the well-being of the whole. This was the rhythm of the siege. Strikes the Flint sat closest to the fire, its designated keeper. The fire was not a passive thing. It was a living entity that required constant, subtle attention. His movements were economical and precise, the result of a lifetime of observation. He did not dump wood onto the flame, but placed each piece of cottonwood with care, arranging it to create the most efficient burn, to generate the most heat with the least amount of smoke and fuel. He would watch the color of the flames, the way the smoke rose, the sound the wood made as it burned. A slight shift in the wind's intensity outside would cause a subtle change in the draft through the smoke hole, and he would adjust the wood accordingly. His entire focus was on this small circle of warmth, his mind in constant communion with the fire, coaxing from it the perfect balance of heat and longevity. He was the guardian of the heart, and his quiet, watchful presence was a source of immense security for the others. Across the fire, Long Arrow Woman sat on her sleeping robe, her willow backrest supporting her straight, strong back. Her hands, gnarled with age but still incredibly nimble, were busy. By the flickering light, she was working on a winter moccasin for her granddaughter, Little Sparrow. Her tool was a sharp awl made from a sharpened piece of bone, and her thread was a strand of sinew, the tough, strong fiber taken from the muscles along a buffalo's spine. She would push the awl through the thick, tanned hide, creating a small hole, and then follow it with the sinew thread, her movements quick and sure. Stitch by stitch, the moccasin took shape, a perfect, durable vessel to protect a small foot from the cold. Her work was not a chore. It was a form of meditation, a quiet expression of love and care that was woven into the very fabric of the things she was making. The soft, rhythmic scraping of the awl against the leather was a comforting, domestic sound. a tiny anchor of normalcy in the midst of the great storm. Beside her, Singing Grass was working as well. She had a small stone bowl, and into it she was grinding a mixture of dried herbs, yarrow to guard against fevers, and the leaves of the wild bergamot, whose fragrant oil could soothe a cough or a tight chest. The soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her stone pestle was another thread in the tapestry of sound. The coming days of confinement in the lodge, with the smoky air and the enforced inactivity, could bring on sickness, and she was preparing the family's medicines, a small act of foresight and protection. Her baby, Sleeping Bear, was now out of his cradleboard, sleeping peacefully beside her, nestled in a soft robe of rabbit fur. Every so often, she would reach out a gentle hand and touch his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his small chest, reassuring herself of his warmth and well-being. The two children, Walks Quietly and Little Sparrow, sat close to their grandfather at the back of the lodge. The excitement and fear of the storm's arrival had given way to a quiet wonder. They were safe, they were warm, and they were together. He who remembers the dawn, knowing that the strength of the mind was as important as the warmth of the body, was telling them a story. He did not speak in a loud, dramatic voice, but in a low, quiet monotone, his words rising and falling with the cadence of an ancient song. It was a story about the old man Coyote, a trickster tale full of foolishness and wisdom, of mischief and unexpected lessons. The story was not just for entertainment. It was a way of passing the time, of distracting the young minds from the howling of the wind, and of subtly reinforcing the values of their people, the importance of cleverness, the dangers of pride, the necessity of listening to one's elders. The soft, steady cadence of his voice was as soothing as a slow heartbeat, another layer of peace in the warm, enclosed world. The lodge was running perfectly. Every system was in place and functioning in harmony. The fire burned cleanly. The smoke drew straight up and out. The liner prevented any drafts, and the warmth of their bodies, their food, and their fire was held securely within the circle of their home. For a few hours, it seemed as if they could remain this way forever, a small, self-contained island of life, untouched by the fury of the world outside. But survival is a dynamic state, not a static one. It requires constant vigilance, an awareness of the small, subtle changes that can signal a shift from security to danger. And it was Strikes the Flint, his eyes trained on the fire and his fuel, who noticed the first sign of a new and serious complication. His gaze moved from the dancing flames to the 3 neat piles of wood he had so carefully gathered and sorted. He looked at the main pile of cottonwood, and then at the small, precious pile of hardwood. He had been feeding the fire sparingly, using only what was necessary to maintain a comfortable warmth. But the cold outside was so intense, so profound, that it was leaching the heat from the lodge faster than he had anticipated. The fire, to do its job, was demanding more fuel than he had planned for. He looked at the hardwood pile again. He had estimated it would be enough for 2, maybe 3 of the coldest nights. But as he looked at it now, really looked at it, and then thought of the many hours of darkness still ahead of just this one night, a cold knot of concern began to form in the pit of his stomach. The pile was smaller than he had thought, much smaller. His hurried gathering in the fading light had not yielded as much of the vital, long-burning fuel as he had hoped. A sudden chilling calculation ran through his mind. The storm outside, which showed no signs of abating, could very well last longer than their best and most essential fuel. It was a soft but serious realization, a quiet and terrifying turn in their fortunes. He did not speak. He did not let the look of concern show on his face, for he did not want to alarm his family. But inside his mind, a new challenge had presented itself. The brute force of the blizzard was one thing. They were prepared for that. But this was a more insidious threat, a war of attrition. The great white siege outside might simply outlast them. A deeper, more subtle layer of wisdom was now required, a knowledge that went beyond simply building and stocking a shelter, a wisdom that could make a little bit of warmth last for a very, very long time. The rhythm of the siege had just become a little more desperate. The quiet dread that settled upon Strikes the Flint did not manifest as panic. Panic was a fire that consumed reason, and reason was the most valuable tool they possessed. He kept his face calm, his movements deliberate, continuing to tend the small central fire as if nothing had changed. Yet inside his mind, the calculus of survival had shifted. The problem of the dwindling woodpile was not one that could be solved with strength or haste. It could not be answered by rushing out into the blinding chaos of the blizzard to find more fuel. To do so would be to invite death. The only solution lay here, inside the lodge, in the realm of knowledge, observation, and quiet adaptation. The challenge was not to create more heat, but to need less of it. It was a problem of efficiency, a test of how much life and warmth could be squeezed from every precious piece of wood. The wisdom he needed now was the wisdom of small things, of tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments that, when combined, could mean the difference between waking to a cold dawn and not waking at all. His father, he who remembers the dawn, had finished his story. The children were growing sleepy, their heads nodding, their bodies warm and secure under their robes. The old man had been watching his son. He had not missed the slight tension in the young man's shoulders, nor the way his eyes kept returning to the small pile of hardwood. He knew, without a word being spoken, what was troubling his son's mind. He had faced this same problem many times in the long seasons of his own life. He leaned forward slightly, his ancient eyes reflecting the firelight, and caught his son's gaze. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of understanding and of reassurance. The knowledge would be there when it was needed, and now was the time. Strikes the Flint's first action was to change the nature of the fire itself. He did not build it up to create a greater reserve of heat against the encroaching cold. Instead, he did the opposite. With a careful stick, he pushed the burning pieces of cottonwood even closer together, consolidating them into a tighter, more compact mass. He then added one of the smallest, gnarled pieces of oak, not laying it on top to burn quickly, but nestling it into the heart of the glowing embers, where it would smolder slowly, releasing its heat with the parsimony of a miser. The fire, which had been a cheerful, bright flame, was now reduced to a deep, pulsing bed of red-orange coals, with only the smallest of flames licking at its surface. The light in the teepee dimmed, became softer, more intimate. The immediate wave of radiant heat lessened, but the coals themselves were now a more concentrated, more enduring heart. They were no longer spending their energy lavishly, but hoarding it, radiating a steady, sufficient warmth that would last far longer. It was a calculated risk, trading a surplus of comfort now for a necessity of survival later. Having made the fire smaller, he now turned his attention to maximizing the benefit from it. He looked at the circle of river stones that had been patiently absorbing the fire's heat all evening. He selected 3 of the hottest ones, and using 2 sturdy sticks as tongs, he lifted them from their place by the hearth. He handed them to his mother, Long Arrow Woman, who had already prepared for this. She took the stones and wrapped each one in several layers of soft, worn deerskin, creating small, warm bundles. One of these she took for herself, placing it beneath her robe to warm the small of her back. The other 2 were for the children, tucked deep into their sleeping robes near their feet, little reservoirs of heat that would slowly bleed their warmth into the bedding for hours, long after the direct radiance of the fire had diminished. They were shifting their reliance from the active, consuming fire to the passive, stored heat of the stones, a far more efficient use of the energy that had already been expended. The next adjustment was even more subtle. It involved the tipi's own breathing system. The father and son both rose and moved with a quiet, synchronized purpose to the 2 smoke flap poles that stood on the outside of the lodge, their tops extending far above the structure. These were the long wooden levers that controlled the ears of the teepee, the 2 large flaps of hide that regulated the size and direction of the smoke hole. Throughout the evening, they had been set to a wide V shape, facing away from the prevailing northwest wind, creating a generous opening for the smoke to escape. But the wind was no longer a steady force from one direction. The blizzard had created a swirling, chaotic vortex of air around the bluff, with gusts now coming from several directions at once. Strikes the flint went to the door, unpinned the flap just enough to peer out into the shrieking darkness, and held up a wet finger, feeling the subtle shifts in the air current at ground level. His father stood inside, his head tilted back, watching the very top of the column of smoke, observing how it behaved as it exited the lodge. It was no longer drawing straight and clean, but was being buffed and pushed back intermittently by the shifting gusts. After a moment of silent, shared observation, they began to make their adjustments. Working together, they maneuvered the long poles, bringing the 2 smoke flaps closer together, narrowing the opening of the smoke hole. They also slightly rotated the entire V shape, angling it to better shield the opening from a newly identified crosswind that was curling around the edge of the cottonwood grove. The change was immediate. With a smaller, better protected opening, the draw of the chimney effect became stronger, more consistent. The column of smoke, which had been wavering, now rose straight and true again. A stronger draw meant a more efficient burn. The fire now required less air to burn cleanly, and it wasted less of its heat fighting against downdrafts. It was a tiny change, a difference of a few inches in the placement of 2 poles 50 feet in the air, but it had a profound impact on the efficiency of their entire heating system, saving precious fuel with every passing moment. These were not dramatic, life-saving actions, taken in a moment of crisis. They were the opposite. They were a series of small, precise, and deeply knowledgeable responses, a quiet conversation with the fire, the wind, and the lodge itself. Each adjustment was based on a lifetime of watching, of listening, and of understanding the delicate balance of forces at play. This was the true nature of their resilience. It was not found in grand gestures, but in the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 such nights, in the knowledge that in the deep of winter, survival is a game of inches, a matter of subtle economies. Knowledge, they understood, weighed nothing. It took up no space in a travois. It could not be depleted like a woodpile. It was the one tool that could never be taken away, the one resource that grew more powerful the more it was used. And as the family huddled a little closer together, sharing the gentler warmth of the smaller fire, they were wrapped not only in their buffalo robes, but in this invisible, unshakable blanket of ancient understanding. The blizzard could rage and howl, but inside the small, breathing mountain, a quiet and powerful wisdom was at work, making the smallest of changes to ensure that there would be a dawn to greet. As the night deepened, pushing toward its coldest and darkest heart, the subtle adjustments to the fire and the lodge had done their work. The small bed of coals pulsed with a steady, enduring life, and the precious hardwood was being consumed at a much slower rate. The stored heat of the stones radiated a gentle warmth into the sleeping robes, and the air inside the teepee remained calm and breathable. They had stretched their resources, applying their knowledge to the very edge of its limits. But now, as the temperature outside continued to plummet under the relentless assault of the blizzard, they turned to the final, oldest, and most powerful heating system they possessed. It was a system that required no wood, no stone, no complex engineering of air currents. It was the simple, profound, and life-affirming warmth of kinship. It was the heat that flowed between them. The grand narrative of survival often focuses on the lone individual, the hero battling against the elements. But the people of the plains knew that this was a dangerous fiction. True resilience was never found in isolation. It was found in the circle of the family, in the community, in the unbreakable bonds of mutual care and responsibility. An individual might possess great skill and knowledge, but a family possessed a collective warmth, both literal and metaphorical, that was exponentially more powerful. As the last of the evening stories were told, and a deep quiet settled into the lodge, punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the soft crackle of the embers, the family began to prepare for sleep, and in doing so, they demonstrated this ultimate principle. Singing Grass gently woke her two children, Walks Quietly and Little Sparrow, who had dozed off listening to their grandfather's voice. She guided them not to their own sleeping robes, but to the space between where she and their father would lie, the children still half asleep, nestled into the warm space, a small body on each side of their mother. She pulled the great, heavy buffalo robes up and over all of them, creating a shared cocoon of warmth. Within this soft, dark space, the children were no longer just relying on their own small body's ability to generate heat. They were now flanked by the larger, stronger furnaces of their parents, their bodies absorbing the radiant warmth from both sides. The parents, in turn, acted as living shields, their own bodies taking the brunt of any residual chill that might seep into the bedding from the outer edges. It was a living, breathing system of shared heat, a perfect and unconscious expression of their interdependence. Long Arrow Woman and he, who remembers the dawn, the two elders, prepared their own sleeping place in a similar fashion. They laid their robes close together, their old bones seeking the familiar comfort of a lifetime of shared winters. Strikes the flint before settling into his own bed. took the hottest of the remaining wrapped stones from the fireside. He walked quietly to his mother's side and gently tucked the warm deerskin-wrapped bundle into the thick fur of her sleeping robe, down by her feet where the circulation was the poorest. She murmured a soft word of thanks, her eyes already closed, her body surrendering to the deep and welcome warmth. It was a small act, a simple gesture, but it was filled with a universe of love, respect, and care. It was the duty of the young and strong to care for the elders, just as it was the duty of the parents to shield the children. These were not rules that needed to be spoken. They were truths that were lived, as natural and as essential as breathing. The circle of care was complete. Within the shared darkness of their individual sleeping robes, a quiet and powerful intimacy settled. The air, which had seemed so vast and cold outside, was now contained in these small, personal spaces. Each breath they exhaled was warm, and it was trapped within the robes, adding its own small measure of heat and humidity to the microclimate they had created. The sound of their own quiet breathing and the even quieter, slower breaths of their sleeping children and parents became a soft, rhythmic chorus. It was the sound of life itself, a gentle and persistent song of existence, pushing back against the formless, soundless fury of the storm. The lodge, which from the outside was a single, lonely point of light in an ocean of darkness, was in fact a vessel teeming with these small, interconnected worlds of warmth. It was not just a shelter of hidden poles, a clever piece of engineering. In these final, deepest hours of the night, its true purpose was revealed. It was a container for the family. It was a physical manifestation of the bonds that held them together, its circular shape a perfect symbol of their unending and interconnected lives. The strength of the lodge was not in its individual poles, but in the way they leaned upon and supported one another to create a unified whole. And so it was with the family inside. Their survival depended not on the strength of any single person, but on the trust, the care, and the shared warmth that flowed between them. This was the quiet, unheralded climax of their preparations. It was not a dramatic confrontation with the storm, but a complete surrender to the wisdom of interdependence. They had done all they could with their knowledge of the physical world. Now they relied on a different, more ancient knowledge, the understanding that in the face of overwhelming force, the greatest strength is found in huddling closer, in sharing the fire, in lending one's own warmth to another. The blizzard could rage against the hide walls, its power immense and terrifying, but it could not touch this. It could not break the circle. It could not chill the warmth that passed from a father to his mother through a simple heated stone, or from a mother to her child through the simple act of lying close in the darkness. As the fire in the center of the teepee burned down to its last precious embers, banked carefully under a blanket of ash, another, more powerful fire continued to burn brightly within the shelter of the sleeping robes, the quiet, unquenchable fire of the human heart, held safe and tended by the simple, profound, and enduring power of family. And in this shared warmth, they slept, their dreams untroubled, their bodies secure, waiting for the storm to break. The passage of time in the heart of the blizzard lost its familiar markers. There was no moon, no stars, no gradual lightening of the east to signal the coming of the day. The world outside the teepee remained a monotonous, roaring vortex of white, a timeless, placeless existence. But for those who lived by the deeper rhythms of the earth, time was still measured. It was measured in the slowing of the breath as sleep deepened, in the gradual cooling of the heated stones, and in the subtle shift in the tone of the wind as the coldest hour of the night, the hour just before dawn, finally arrived. It was in this profoundest part of the night that the storm threw its last, most violent energies against the small shelter. The wind's howl rose in pitch to a shriek, and the weight of the snow pressing against the hide walls seemed to become immense, a physical pressure trying to crush the small bubble of life within. Yet inside, the family slept on, their slumber deep and untroubled, their bodies secure in the multi-layered fortress of warmth they had created together. They had done everything they could. They had used their knowledge, their resources, and their love for one another. All that was left was to trust in the strength of their lodge and the wisdom of their ancestors. The first sign of the change was not a sight, but a sound, or rather, a change in the sound. Strikes the flint, whose sleep was always light, a hunter's sleep was the first to perceive it. The relentless, high-pitched shriek of the wind, which had been the only music of the night, began to lose its edge. Its voice began to deepen, the monotonous roar fracturing into individual shuddering gusts, with moments of profound quiet in between. The oppressive, bone-deep pressure against the tipi walls seemed to lessen, to lift. It was as if the great beast of the storm was growing tired, its rage finally beginning to subside. He lay still for a long time, his eyes open in the darkness of the sleeping robe, listening. He heard the roar recede, replaced by a lower, mournful moan. And then even that began to soften, to fray at the edges, until all that was left was a steady, rhythmic hiss, the sound of the last snow falling not horizontally, but vertically in the now calmer air. The great siege was ending. The battle was over. Slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb his sleeping wife and children, he slipped out from under the heavy buffalo robe. The air inside the teepee was cold, a deep and penetrating chill that spoke of a fire that had long since burned down to its last embers. But it was a still cold, a peaceful cold, free from the insidious draughts that would have marked a true failure of their shelter. He moved with a practiced silence to the center of the lodge, his bare feet making no sound on the reed mats. He knelt before the fire pit, which was now just a circle of stones, around a smooth grey blanket of ash. With a small, pointed stick, he gently probed the heart of the ash pile. A faint, almost invisible wisp of heat shimmered in the air. He pushed the stick deeper, and then a tiny, brilliant spark of orange glowed in the darkness, a testament to the wisdom of banking the coals. The fire had not died. Its heart was still beating, waiting patiently to be called back to life. As he was gently coaxing the ember back to life, another change occurred. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the smoke hole at the very apex of the tipi. Throughout the long night, it had been a circle of absolute, impenetrable black. But now it was no longer black. It had begun to change, to soften. A faint, ethereal light, a color he had no name for, was beginning to gather there. It was a deep, mysterious, and incredibly pure blue, the color of a twilight sky in the heart of winter, the color of clean, cold air and freshly fallen snow. It was the coming of the blue light, the first hint of a dawn that was still hours away, but was now, finally, inevitable. The storm had broken. The sky, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, was clear. That small, distant circle of blue was a promise, a message that the world, which had been lost, was about to be returned to them. A profound sense of peace and of quiet, bone-deep gratitude filled him. They had done it. They had weathered the storm. Their knowledge had held true. Their family was safe. He turned his attention back to the fire, now with a renewed sense of purpose. He blew gently on the glowing ember, feeding it the smallest, driest bits of tinder. A tiny flame flickered, then caught, and soon a small, cheerful fire was once again dancing in the center of the lodge, its light pushing back the cold and the shadows. The familiar, comforting scent of burning wood once again filled the air. As the light and warmth grew, the rest of the family began to stir, woken not by a sound, but by the gentle return of comfort and the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Long Arrow Woman sat up, a faint smile on her lips, her old feet still warm from the stone that had shared its heat with her all night. The children emerged from their cocoon of robes, their faces flushed with sleep, their eyes blinking in the new light of the fire. When the fire was burning steadily, tended now by his wife, Strikes the Flint moved to the entrance of the teepee. He carefully removed the wooden pins that had stitched the door flap shut against the storm. With a gentle push, he opened the door and looked out upon the new world. He was met with a sight of such pristine and silent beauty that it took his breath away. The world had been reborn in white. The valley, which had been a familiar landscape of brown grasses and grey trees, was now a smooth, clean canvas of deep, unmarked snow. Every feature was softened, every harsh line erased, buried under a thick, insulating blanket that sparkled under the faint, pre-dawn light. The air that greeted him was painfully cold, a dry, sharp cold that burned in the lungs, but it was clean and still. The chaotic violence of the night was gone, replaced by a profound and all-encompassing silence, a silence so deep it seemed to have a sound of its own. The cottonwood trees stood cloaked in white, their branches heavy with snow, and the bluff that had been their shield was now a great sleeping animal, its back covered in a thick white fleece. In this new, clean world, there was a sense of immense peace, of a great and cleansing trial having passed. He stepped out into the deep snow, the cold biting at his ankles, and looked up at the sky. It was a vast, dark canopy, studded with the last of the winter stars, their light sharp and brilliant in the clear air. In the east, the deep blue was beginning to give way to a faint line of pale green and soft violet. The dawn was coming. He took a deep breath of the cold, pure air, and when he exhaled, his breath plumed in a thick, white cloud. He felt a deep connection to this place, to this moment. They had not conquered the storm. They had not defeated the winter. They had simply endured it. They had met its force, not with force of their own, but with wisdom, with patience, with respect, and with a quiet, unshakable trust in each other. They had bent like the willow, not broken like the proud oak. And now, they had emerged on the other side, into the clean, quiet stillness of the new day. Inside the lodge, the fire glowed, its golden light a beacon of life and warmth. The family was safe. The great storm had passed. It had taken nothing from them. Instead, it had given them a gift, a reminder of the strength they held together, and of the ancient, powerful wisdom that flowed through them like a quiet, deep river. And in the heart of that small, glowing home, a new day and a new winter had just begun.